Not long ago, I was hanging out in a coffee shop with a friend of mine, and we talked about everything under the sun. We talked about family and other relationships and books we've been reading and religion and philosophy and politics. And it occurred to me that, wow, if you just have one or two good conversations a day, then that makes for an amazing day. In the same way, if you have one or two difficult conversations where you don't really feel like things went very well, maybe there was some disrespect going on in that conversation, that can really ruin an otherwise good day. Conversations are, if you think about it, our day is one conversation to the next, whether it's over email or Facebook or texting or face-to-face. Conversations really are that fabric that weaves our day. And so we're going to look in the different traditions at theories that explain how conversations work and sometimes how they don't work, and also the work that they do in our relationships. As is our pattern, we will start with some theories in the psychological tradition. The socio-psychological tradition, again, as a reminder, is looking for the communication causes and effects in conversations. They're looking at isolating independent and dependent communication variables. And what I mean by independent and dependent communication variables is that's a quantitative or statistical pairing of terms there, independent and dependent variables. If you are doing a study and you are able to change something, then you're, in other words, someone's hair length, or as we talked about in a previous lecture, how excited they are, like the three salespeople, whether or not their shirt is tucked in, the degree to which they're smiling, etc. Those are the independent variables. Those are the ones that you as the researcher have control over. You isolate that specific thing, you tuck the shirt in, you comb the hair, etc. The dependent variable is the one that depends upon people's reaction, depends upon how they respond to the things you've changed in your study. And so the socio-psychological tradition is very much about changing the independent variable and seeing the effect on the dependent variable. In other words, your perception of what you're noticing. So there's the cause and the effect. The independent variable is the cause, if you will, and the dependent variable is the effect. That's one way to think of that. And so this approach focuses on, again, what's happening psychologically during conversations, what's happening in your brains that makes you want to express yourself in a certain way, and what is happening in your brains that make you interpret or receive a message in a certain way. And so our mental reaction in conversations is important, and this approach does not always look at our verbal or nonverbal reaction. And in the experiments and the surveys, for example, they might have you watch a little video clip and then you just fill out a little survey of what's going on. Or they put you in a situation in an experimental setting, and then afterward they ask you what you were thinking or what was going on. So they're not always looking directly at behavior. They might be just looking at how you processed that in the moment. Uncertainty reduction is perhaps the most well-known theory in the socio-psychological area of research, especially interpersonal communication research. You've probably talked about it in other classes. Perhaps you've talked about it in your course, interpersonal communication. And this theory says that we have a very strong desire to reduce uncertainty, especially about people we meet, new people we meet, or even existing people that we meet. We want to be able to predict how that person will behave so that our uncertainty is reduced. So we want to know what we're dealing with in an interaction, how to understand what the person is going to do, how they're going to act, how they're going to behave. And from this theory, the assumption here is that one of our main, if not the main reason to seek information and communicate in an interaction is to reduce uncertainty. Main motivation. That is quite different, for example, than what Kenneth Burke says, as we discussed, and he says that guilt is one of the main factors, the main influences or motivations for the kinds of communication that we engage in to bridge that gap between where we are and where we want to be, to resolve that tension. But this theory says, no, it's really our desire to reduce uncertainty. And they say if you look at communication, people are almost always seeking information, asking questions, trying to figure things out so that they can understand what they're dealing with, to reduce their level of uncertainty, anxiety, not knowing what's going to happen. So when uncertainty is high, according to this theory, then we have a very high motivation for seeking information and for communicating. So there's the two variables. Uncertainty is high, and then the other variable is affected. Seeking information becomes high. And so according to this theory, as our uncertainty reduces, so does our desire to communicate, which is really a debatable claim. There's a couple of different views on this. So most people would agree with this idea that when your uncertainty is high, you are going to seek out information and communicate more. Some people disagree, for example, though, that as our uncertainty reduces, that our desire to seek information or communication reduces. You might say, for example, the better you get to know someone, the less there is to talk about, or the less need you have to talk. And certainly some people have experienced that. They get to know somebody, for example, a married couple, and there are not as many questions that need to be answered the longer that you live together. You get to know the person, and maybe you just don't need to talk. My wife said that one of her fears is to be an old married couple with nothing left to talk about. And I think, okay, well, that could happen, but I doubt it, because we've been married for 12 years and together for 15, and we have not slowed down on talking. So on the other hand, other people say that that does happen. So it's a really debatable claim, and I'm not here to try to settle it. But one thing is certain is that the fellow who came up with this theory and who did most of the research in this area is pretty adamant that he has the data that shows that this happens. One of the challenges against him, of course, is that you would say, well, there may be other motivations to communicate than to reduce our uncertainty. So maybe you want to communicate just to feel close to somebody, to bond, to connect. Maybe you want to communicate to entertain somebody. As Burke said, maybe you're communicating in some way, even without knowing it, to reduce your guilt. And we put guilt in quotations because it doesn't necessarily mean you did something wrong. As we mentioned, he uses that term to cover a lot of different things. So it's a debatable claim. However, he is onto something. The author here is onto something who created this theory, in that it does seem like, in fact, when our uncertainty is high, we do often seek out lots of information. So we'll table the debate for now, but know that some of this theory is somewhat debatable. There are three main strategies that we use to reduce our uncertainty, and you've probably done these yourself. The first one, this, by the way, this is not in order, but sometimes they do happen in order. They're not necessarily in order, as you'll see in a minute. But the first one, the most common one, is passively observing somebody. So you're noticing. You're not making any special effort to notice, but you see someone come in the room, and for whatever reason you have a certain level of uncertainty about them. Perhaps you have an interest in them in some way, either a friendly interest, a romantic interest, a professional interest, what have you, and you start observing what's going on. So you look at where they sit, you look at how they act, and without even necessarily trying or realizing you're trying, you're collecting information about that person to reduce their uncertainty. And so there might be some things that you might notice about them that might reduce that uncertainty. There might be some things that you notice about them that make you more uncertain. So if they come in and sit down and they are very polite to people around them and they're smiling and they look pleasant, then you might be able to determine that they are a relatively friendly person. That would reduce your uncertainty. Now, you didn't know much about them. Now you know that they seem to be, at least on the surface, a friendly person. So you just observe. This is from a distance. You're not making much effort to do it. It's just happening almost before you realize it. The active strategy is where you find out information about the person. You put in some effort, but you're not talking directly to the person yet. You're not interacting with the person. You're taking an active role in asking a third party, like a wingman. You ask your friend, hey, what do you know about her? Or have you ever seen that guy before? And you find out information. And that might reduce your uncertainty. For example, when I first met my wife, before I met my wife, I saw her at the student union at the college that we were both going to, and I thought she looked really pretty. I did that passive observing, and then I asked some of the people I was with, hey, do you know who that is? Have you ever seen her before? So that was a third party, and we often do that. Again, it's almost automatic. Facebook stalking is, maybe that word stalking should be in quotes because this is an expression, but that's when you're on some kind of social media and you're looking into that person a little bit. You don't know much about them, but you're looking into that person, looking at some of their photos, looking at some of the mutual friends you might have, and finding things out about them. And just like observing, the risks here are relatively low. You're just really keeping your distance. You're orbiting around that person in various ways, but they have some space, and so you're not bothering them. You're just finding out information in a relatively safe way. And by the way, you may find some things out about this person at this stage that either make you want to get to know them better or seek out more information, or you may learn some things that cause you to go in a different direction. So let's say I saw my wife, she looked very pretty to me, and I asked a couple of people and nobody knew anything about her, and finally I ran into somebody who did know her, and I said, hey, what do you know about her? And they said, oh man, stay away from her. She steals all the time and she just cannot stop lying. She is a bad seed. And so I think, wow, I am so glad that I reduced my uncertainty by asking a third party and not getting involved with her in any way. Now, thankfully, people did not say that about her, of course. Otherwise, I probably would not have sought out the third strategy, which is interactive. Interactive is where you talk directly to that person. You ask them questions. Hey, how you doing? Where are you from? And you find out all kinds of information. And even non-verbally, you're finding out information because as they respond to you, they might do so in a polite, friendly, supportive way, an open way, or they might be defensive and rude. And see, that's still helping you understand something about them that can reduce your uncertainty one way or the other. And so you continue to ask questions. Maybe you find out that you have a lot in common, and so forth. Now I'm using this, my early interactions with my now wife, but this works for roommates too, right? You might observe someone and get to know them a little bit. You might find out what you can about them to see if they might make a good roommate. Maybe you're looking for a roommate, or maybe you got assigned a roommate automatically through the school, or maybe your other roommates had to find somebody and you were on a vacation. A student recently did a presentation on that, and she was away and someone dropped out, and so her other roommates had to quickly line up another roommate so they didn't get charged extra rent and so forth. Once she heard about who that roommate was, of course, she asked all about that person, went on Facebook and so forth, and finally when they moved in together, they started talking and reducing uncertainty that way. So here are some different ways that we reduce uncertainty. That's a very commonly used theory in this field, and obviously it applies to a lot of different situations, especially when we're first getting to know people. The accommodation theory is one that you've personally experienced, even though you may not have known it. Here we have a picture from the movie Avatar. There will be spoiler alerts announced here because I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happens in the movie. But if you haven't seen Avatar, then you might be the last human being alive who has not, since it's the most popular movie of all time. I don't feel too guilty about telling you some of the things that happen in it. But according to this theory, we are naturally and even subconsciously adjusting our verbal and nonverbal communication behaviors toward other people. As we interact with them, we change things like our body posture, and if we're converging with that person, meaning we're getting closer to that person, we will adjust our body posture to match or mimic theirs. We'll change the rate of speech that we're using to match or mimic theirs. If they gesture a certain way, we might without realizing it gesture the same way. We might adopt a similar accent to that person without, again, noticing it. And We might get excited when they get excited and so forth. That's convergence, when our nonverbals and verbal behaviors, very specific behaviors, start to come together and be the same. And that's what we saw happening in this movie Avatar. So the guy on the left is actually a regular human being in some kind of science lab, but he occupies this body of this avatar and enters this tribe, becomes part of the tribe, and they know that he's different than them. They understand what's going on, but nevertheless, they at first he's like a hostile force, and this lady on the right treats him that way and is acts very different from him and differentiates. She diverges in the way she talks and the way she behaves. Over time, however, they non-verbally start acting the same. She adjusts a tiny bit to him, and he adjusts quite a bit to her, and they become very converged, and they start to move the same and talk the same and act the same until he looks like he's a member of the tribe. And so that is what ends up happening there. You'll often that's how a lot of movie makers will show convergence. They show, especially in romantic movies and romantic comedies and things like that, they'll show people very far apart at the beginning, and maybe we want those people to get together, but they show them apart, and they do that non-verbally. They show them diverging, acting differently. One person is sitting, the other one is standing. One person is speaking slowly, the other person is speaking rapidly. The other person has their arms open, the other one's closed, and you see that divergence. And then over the course of the movie, they don't turn to the camera and say, see, we're getting closer now, things are starting to work out. That would be too obvious, it would be boring. But what they do is they show it non-verbally oftentimes through the tone of voice, through how they look at each other, through how they stand next to each other. And then I've often been watching a movie and I think I'm onto it. Like, you know what? I bet you those two are going to get together. I bet you. You wait. I just noticed something. It's hard to put in words. I noticed something right there. And then sure enough, they end up getting closer by the end of the movie. And, you know, the movie makers know what they're doing. I'm not like discovering something before the movie makers did. Obviously, they know where the story is going, and they're giving us little clues, little breadcrumbs to get us a little excited about anticipating what might happen. It's one of the ways they show who the bad guys are very early on. You get a sense for, I don't know, there's something about him. They're just showing a little bit of divergence, how people separate. And convergence is where people come together. Convergence and divergence can be both mutual and non-mutual. Mutual convergence is where one person is adapting to the other and the other person is adapting to them. So they're both starting to pick up on behaviors of each other and act like each other. And you see this oftentimes when people are at similar levels of status and power, where they both adapt toward each other to converge. You see non-mutual convergence where one person stays the same, oftentimes a very high status person, and the other lower status person adapts to that person. So let me give you an example. If I ever get to meet Michael Jordan, it's quite possible that I'll start to pick up on things that he's doing and might even start to act a little bit like him. It is highly unlikely, however, that Michael Jordan is going to start to pick up on my behaviors and act like me. High status people do not tend to adapt to low status people. That would be not an example of non-mutual convergence, when one person adapts but the other stays the same. It's still convergence, but it's one-way convergence. And the same is true for divergence. Sometimes one person is staying the same and the other person deliberately acts different to separate themselves. And then other times both people accentuate the differences between them to show that they're diverging. Expectancy violation theory is a very well-known popular theory in the area of interpersonal communication. It's a classic socio-psychological theory. And it says that we have, one, expectations for our interactions with other people, for our conversations with other people. And those expectations, or they call them expectancies, come from that specific relationship. So we have a history with that person, or maybe a very short relationship. But either way, we have an expectation based upon that specific relationship. And then we have the contextual social norms. So a job interview has different norms and expectations than drinks after dinner, has very different expectations than church on a Sunday morning, etc. And then we have a local culture that we all come from, presumably, and that is going to shape how we interact with other people. For example, in Italy, they're very touchy, and they'll kiss you on both cheeks, and we don't tend to do that in the United States so much, at least in a general sense. Maybe certain subcultures do, or within families, but that each of us walks into a situation with those kinds of expectations when I'm going to interact with them. And so you know how, if you're going to interact with your mom, you have a certain set of expectations about what that looks like. If you're going to interact with your best friend, you have expectancies. That's what they call them, expectancies, about how you're going to interact with that person, how that conversation is going to go. If you're having a conversation with your boss, same thing. You have all these expectancies, but they're different. Every individual relationship, every social context, every local cultural situation has collectively forms different expectancies. Number two is we all experience a violation valence if that person exceeds or falls below what we expect. So the word violation is, we tend to think of that as a negative word, but in this theory it's not. It's a technical term that means they either go above it, so they violate it by exceeding the expectations, or they violate it by falling below the expectations. And there's a little range we have where they might meet it. And if they meet our expectations, we probably don't notice it. It goes normally. So a positive violation is where the person goes above and beyond. Maybe you meet somebody and you don't necessarily expect them to be all that warm and friendly, but they are. They're much more engaging and kind than you thought they would be. And so that's a positive violation. That's called violation valence. Valence just means charge or value, positive charge. You think, wow, that was great. You might also experience, let's say you're expecting someone to be relatively friendly, and they go below that. They meet you and they don't really give you a very good handshake. They don't look you in the eye, and you think, wow, that was disappointing. Maybe they don't measure up to what you expected. And so that's a negative violation. A negative violation, however, could also come if someone does things that might appear to be positive, but you don't like them. So let's say you were expecting someone to be a little more appropriate or professional in terms of how much contact they made with you, but then they were really huggy and touchy and it got kind of creepy. Well, that would, even though that's more expressiveness, that would still be negative, a negative violation. A lot of us have experienced that. And so this guy to the right is visiting a zoo, and he probably did not realize he would get this close to a giraffe. I don't know what his expectations were when he went in. He probably didn't expect this. I'm not sure if he would think this is a positive or a negative violation. It depends on how much he likes giraffes, I suppose, and his past relationship with this giraffe. And so then we experience a reward valence. We see that interaction, that conversation, as either positive or negative, and then we have when we view that person, we see them as more positively or negatively, and we experience it in that way. And so there's like the outcome. Positive violation usually leads to a positive reward valence, and negative violation usually leads to a negative reward valence. The reward valence here is almost common sense. If someone exceeds your expectations, you're going to feel good about that. That's the reward. If someone falls below expectations or violates them, we're going to feel badly about it. So these words are, words like violation or valence. They sound a little technical, but just remember that a violation is not necessarily negative. Like a traffic violation is always negative, right? But here, violation can be both positive or negative, and it is just a term that indicates that someone either went above or fell below what we would have hoped in that given situation. So you can see the cause-effect logic here happening. There's a cause, a violation, and then an effect, the reward valence. So here are a couple of examples. I'll start with Mr. Elijah Wood. As many of you know, he is a well-known actor, and he played the part of Frodo Baggins, among other parts in his career. But a lot of people mistake him for Harry Potter, the guy who played Harry Potter, which is a different actor. And so I once read of a story where, by the way, he gets mistaken for Harry Potter often, and so you have to put yourself in his shoes a little bit to hear this story. I'm sure he's a very nice person. Anyway, this story happened where he was in a large building. I think it was a very tall hotel, one with a long elevator ride. And so he was on this elevator, and another gentleman got onto the elevator with him, and he recognized him. And Elijah Wood is used to being recognized. So the door's closed, and the guy turns to him and says nothing more than, "Harry Potter?" And Elijah Wood, who I'm sure is just exhausted from this pattern, just says, "Nope." And then the two people ride down the entire elevator ride in silence for like 40 floors. And they get to the bottom, and the elevator doors open, and they just go their separate ways. And I think to myself, wow, if I were meeting a celebrity, I would have a whole bunch of expectancies about how that would go. I would hope, for example, that they would be friendly and nice and open. And so I would probably have a negative violation and then a negative reward valence for that interaction. And for Elijah Wood, I might see him a little differently. Let's be fair, though. They're people, right? And so why are they obligated to be friendly and supportive and, oh, yeah, to every part? I mean, it must be very strange to have total strangers coming up to you, and they're pretending they know you, but they don't even know who you are. They think you're a totally different person. And it must be a confusing situation that must get a little overdone. So we can excuse and look past that. But in the moment, I'm sure that was a negative reward valence at the end for that person riding the elevator. Bill Murray is an actor, a very well-known actor, who's sitting here in the middle holding the microphone, and he's singing karaoke with some people he just met. And the story goes, and there's a lot of stories about Bill Murray, and at least some of them I'm sure are true, is that some people met him in a hotel, restaurant, bar type situation, and they bought him a drink and said, might be out of the blue, but we're in room number whatever later, and we're going to be singing karaoke. We have a machine. We're going to have a great time. And come on up. We're going to be there literally all through the morning, because this is already maybe 10 p.m. They said, we're going to be there all through the night singing karaoke. Come on up. And so he says, okay, no, thanks anyway. But then at about 2 in the morning or so, he shows up at the door. And he says, hey, let's do some karaoke. And so they're so excited. And so one of them quickly snapped a phone picture that she didn't realize. And they hung out and had some drinks for a few hours. And then at the end of their time together, he got up to go, and he gave one of them a hug, and he whispered in his ear, "No one's ever going to believe you." And I'm sure that this was when you come in with expectations, you certainly don't expect a celebrity to be this amazing, right? I mean, this is wow, over the top. But I've actually heard many stories. There's a whole website dedicated to crazy things that Bill Murray has done like this, and that's a very positive violation of our expectations, and then a high reward valence. And as a result, people love these stories about Bill Murray, because you would think, wow, if I ever meet a celebrity, I really hope they act like this.